Shabbat Shalom and another early Chag Sameach. So I wanted to set aside this time because Shabbat Hagadol historically was one of the only 2 times in the entire year that a rabbi would give a sermon. But the rabbis would give a sermon that were hours and hours long in Shabbat Hagadol on the issue of Pesach, both the Seder as well as koshering. And I figured you probably didn't want me standing on the bima for a couple hours, and you probably don't want me standing back here for a couple hours either, we'll see. But I did want to make sure that we had time to go over just a few things. So we've got our nutshell handout, and as you can see, it's got basically 2 sections. The first page, front and back, is the ultimate thumbnail version of how to kosher for Pesach. A lot of people get caught up in spring cleaning while trying to do Passover cleaning. That is not recommended. I learned when I was in Japan that they do their spring cleaning in winter, which makes a whole lot more sense, rather than trying to do it when the holiday of Passover is on top of us. So by all means, take a look through it. If you have questions, please let me know, but this is meant to be your take-home reference guide. And it should go along with the up-to-date annual by annual Rabbinical Assembly Guide, which I sent a link out in the email yesterday, and it's also been sent out through the WhatsApp. If you didn't get it, didn't see it, want personalized concierge service of having the link delivered to you, let me know, and I'll make sure that you can see that. It gets updated every year because the Rabbinical Assembly keeps an eye on different types of products and manufacturing to see if there's been any shift in some of the issues regarding certain products, and then they can give you an update on different things. So please double check that. The other thing that was also sent out in the email, as well as put in through the WhatsApp, and I think maybe was also on our Facebook, is Mechirat Chametz. I want to talk a little bit about that because as you read through this guide, you're going to see that the reference to Mechirat Chametz is rather important. Mechirat Chametz is the selling of Chametz. It is very misunderstood, and it is very important. A lot of people think that the sale of Chametz before Pesach is silly. Like, what, I'm just selling my chametz, but it's still in my house. How is that really getting rid of my chametz? Is this really what the Torah wanted me to do? Yada, yada, yada. Good question. Excellent. Don't like the snark, but it's a good question. Okay, so what is actually going on with Mechirat Chametz? Well, to understand Mechirat Chametz, you have to actually put your mind into a different mode. If you think of chametz as only being the loaf of bread that's in your cupboard, the box of Cheerios that's in your pantry, the pasta waiting to be boiled up, your leftover rice from your sushi last week. Well, yes, that is chametz, although rice is questionable, but that's not the chametz that Mechirat Chametz is aiming at. When we sell our chametz, we're not using it to preserve the half-eaten sandwich that's in our freezer. Selling our chametz is a very different goal. The half-eaten sandwich, by all means, get rid of that before Pesach. And things that are opened and spoiled or in the process of spoiling, by all means, get rid of. If it hasn't been opened, or if it's still in people would actually buy this kind of packaging, individual candy bars or something like that, then we're talking about selling the chametz. But the real chametz that we're talking about for the sale of chametz is the chametz that you can't see. In kashrut, we understand that objects will absorb the flavors of the things that are cooked in them. Your pots, your pans, your toaster, your oven perhaps, depending upon how you are going to prepare for Passover, many of these objects may still have chametz embedded in them. Now, some of them, like your average pot and pan and your oven, can be re-koshered, which is what this guide talks about, to cause it to expel anything that it has absorbed. And that's great. That's how you get your pots and pans ready for Passover. It's how you can get your oven ready for Passover. And that's what this guide is about. But some of us living in the 21st century have more pots and pans than we know what to do with. And we don't want to just throw away the ones we're not going to kosher, and we don't want to have to kosher all of them, and some of them we probably can't kosher. Certain things like toasters don't do well if you put them into a pot of boiling water. It's not a good idea for the long-term health of your toaster, or you, for that matter. Likewise, food processors can often be very difficult to rekosher, and many of our plates, which are made out of ceramics, are either difficult or impossible to rekosher. And so we would be forced to dispose of all of those every single year because we wouldn't be able to cause them to expel any chametz that was still embedded in them. When we sell our chametz, we are selling that embedded residue of chametz, and that is what is being taken care of. So don't think of it as being, how can I get around having to throw away my half-eaten box of pasta? Think of it as, how can I get around not having to throw away 80% of my kitchenware and having to buy it again at the end of the holiday? I'm sure the local economy would love that, but it's really not necessary. And the sale of chametz is important because if you don't sell your chametz, well, then you are still in ownership of the embedded residue in all of those pots, pans, and kitchenware. And, well, that is a violation of what the Torah has asked us to do to prepare for the holiday. Now, how hard is it to sell your chametz? Well, it's as simple as click, enter, enter, click. The Rabbinical Assembly has finally caught up to the 21st century, and they have an online form that all you have to do is go to the link that I've sent out by email as well as WhatsApp, and you can finish selling your chametz in about 30 seconds, as long as you know your address. And if you don't know your address, talk to me afterwards, and I'll help you get home. Uh-huh. Oh, okay, so many of us have special pots, pans, dishes, knives, forks that we use just for Passover, and that can be an incredible convenience, and recognize the privilege that we enjoy of living in the 21st century where mass-produced goods will make that possible. But what do we do in terms of swapping over, of bringing things out that are for Pesach, and what do we do with the things we're not koshering that we don't want to keep out for Pesach, that we aren't going to use during Pesach, and in fact we're selling the residue within them? Well, we store them. So I will say that in my household, our counters are never so clear as during Passover. Everything that we're not using, that isn't actually Pesach, gets put into a cupboard, and that cupboard gets a nice big stripe of painter's tape put across it, so that no one accidentally opens it up and borrows a fork or something from inside of it that hasn't been koshered for Passover. So clear it away, put it under your cupboards, put it in the garage, put it somewhere out of sight where it will not be accidentally used. Like I said, we like to use the old painter tape on the cupboards just so that we have that visual reminder that stuff in here is not for Passover. And with the sale of chametz, that's all you need to do. So it doesn't even have to leave your premises if you've sold the chametz and you've put it in a place that will not be accidentally used. Put some ribbon around the handles. Tie a string, around the old oak tree. Whatever works for your house, your cupboard style, to be a visual reminder that things in here are not for Passover use is perfect. I mean, like our whole pantry gets sealed up. Not that there's much left in it at this point anyway, but we have all of our food that we're going to eat just laid out on a table in our actual dining room, because the dining room is not big enough for the Seder. So that just becomes our temporary pantry for a week. And that works just fine. So whatever works with your living arrangement, you can find a way to make it visual and clear, and Passover will be a lot easier. Other questions or comments about the sale of chametz or about the koshering? Anybody who was looking through this that didn't understand something? Just a few points I always like to drive home because it gets lost if you don't pay attention, is when we're getting rid of chametz, we're not getting rid of dirt, right? Chametz and shmutz may both come from more or less the same language, but they are not the same thing. Chametz is something that comes, as we can see in the textual sheet on the third page, from one of the 5 grains: wheat, spelt, barley, rye, and oats. Dirt doesn't. Right? You bring in dirt from the mud outside, That doesn't mean you have chametz. You can have dirty footprints all over your floors. You're not breaking Pesach. You may be breaking the norms of polite company in 21st century Florida, but that's okay, right? God doesn't care about Florida culture. God cares about Torah. So chametz is only something that was made with one of those 5 grains and which was then allowed to rise, which is basically 18 minutes, which means pretty much everything that wasn't purpose-built matzah is chametz if it has one of those 5 grains in it. Now, our ancestors, however, were also very careful that when they are talking about things that have to be gotten rid of, they understand that we are not going and shouldn't be going around with a microscope or a magnifying glass looking for chametz and a test kit in the other hand. That is not necessary. The only thing that qualifies as chametz with regards to the mitzvah of cleaning for Pesach is removing things that are the size of an olive or larger. So think, yay big. If you got a crumb that big, get rid of it. If there are specks somewhere embedded underneath the stove or refrigerator, don't tilt it up and get your Swiffer in there. That's not needed. Not only is it too small, but it also falls under the second important point, which is once it has become inedible, once it is no longer food because it has been spoiled either by being charred to oblivion because it's been stuck under the oven for years, or because it has come into contact with toxic cleaning chemicals, then it is no longer food. It may have originally come from one of those 5 grain species, but now it is beyond human consumption, indeed beyond even fit for a dog, and therefore it no longer qualifies as chametz either. You may still want to get rid of it just because of good cleanliness in your house and all of that. And you never know what the ants may be willing to eat that even your dog won't. But if it comes to preparation for Pesach, it is not something that you need to fret and worry about. It is something that is not going to result in a violation of this mitzvah. So those are 2 varying things. Size of an olive hasn't been spoiled beyond recognition as food. That's what you're trying to get rid of. And I'm guessing, looking around the room, no one here looks like they're a me at the age of 20 living the slobbish life of a college student with food just sort of thrown around everywhere and empty bowls that I hadn't cleaned for a week and a half. Most of you probably keep a house that is not overflowing with this kind of debris. And this should not be a major tircha, a major burden for most of us in preparing for Passover. In addition, one of the other major points that is brought by the text that I have shared with you is you don't have to clean where you don't eat. So if you have a closet where you never take food, if you have a bathroom where you never take food, if you've got a back den that you only use for a hobby or something, but you're never taking food in there, that's fine. You don't need to actually strip it all down, wipe every surface, vacuum the whole thing. If you know that food never went into your attic, don't go into your attic. If you know that there are certain things stored in your closets that you only ever see when you take them out to clean them for Passover, you don't have to take them out to clean them for Passover. Leave them where they are. Or maybe even get rid of them, donate them to someone who might use them more than just an object of Passover fixation. So yes, there are lots of things that we don't need to do that people think we have to, that create a burdensome atmosphere before Pesach. And as the commentary that I brought for you points out, if you create such a burden for Passover that you are no longer looking forward to the holiday because it's too much work to prepare for, then you're missing the point of the holiday. Pesach is meant to be joyous and celebratory. It is not meant to make you feel like a slave. We try to feel like a slave during the Seder by eating matzah and bitter herbs and all those other things. We're not supposed to feel like a slave because we are slaving away, scrubbing our linoleum with a toothbrush. Make sense? In the extended commentary, the rabbi brought a beautiful insight. He said, look, in the ancient world, people lived in like one-room huts that you just swept out the dirt floor and you were pretty much good for Pesach. And then in the late, by the time we reach the late Middle Ages or the Renaissance or modern times, people often, if they had big homes, had servants. And fine, if I've got 13 people working for me, then it's easy for us to get together and get ready for Pesach. It's only within the late 19th century and then into the 20th century that Jews have lived an affluent life with the consumer culture without servants to help make it reasonable. And therefore, we have to actually rely upon halakha rather than just our fastidiousness when strategizing how we'll prepare for Pesach. Questions or comments on any of that? Yes? About Shabbat HaGadol, about today's Shabbat, yes. Mm-hmm. Put it in their house. Is that because of that they call it Shabbat HaGadol, or is that something else? No. So the question for those who couldn't hear Jocelyn was, we know that we needed to, in the ancient world, set aside a lamb that was going to be our Passover lamb by the 10th of the month in order to be sure that we had one ready, we knew which one was going to be ours, and it was dedicated for this purpose. And the question was, is that why Shabbat HaGadol is called Shabbat HaGadol? No. Shabbat HaGadol is actually called Shabbat HaGadol partly because it is a reminder. Did someone put the alarm on? Oh, the refrigerator beep. Okay. Okay, it's being taken care of. Okay, phew. Okay, so Shabbat HaGadol is called Shabbat HaGadol for two reasons. One, it's the Shabbat before Pesach, and that means it is like the dun-da-da-da, final call, Passover coming up, come on guys, get with it. And again, despite some people I know who begin their Passover koshering just after Purim, in the ancient world and all the way up until the modern world, most people were beginning their Passover koshering right between Shabbat HaGadol and the start of Pesach, which would usually be a couple days later, on average for the weekly schedule. But the other reason is because it was the one of two times that the rabbi actually gave a sermon. And that was one of the reasons it was called Shabbat HaGadol. It was the big Shabbat because the rabbi was giving a big sermon. The notion of having a rabbi give a sermon weekly during the service was something that was introduced by the Reform movement in the 1800s. Prior to that, first of all, rabbis were not primarily servants of a synagogue. They were servants of the community. And the rabbi, of course, would go to services with the community at the synagogue, but it wasn't the synagogue that was their employer, it was the community that was their employer. And so they kind of only sort of let the rabbi do these kinds of things twice a year in classical Jewish communities. And then the Reform movement came along and said, you know what? Our Protestant or Catholic neighbors, they've got preachers up there every week giving lectures about their religion. We should do that too, and in German. Right? That was a major revolution. That it would be that you would actually say something from the Bima in a language that the average person would understand. Now, of course, originally everything from the Bima was a language they understood because it was Hebrew, and when people stopped knowing Hebrew, they added prayers in Aramaic because it was more commonly understood. But by the late Middle Ages, beginning of the Enlightenment period, some communities had begun looking askance at quote, Jewish languages being used for ritual purposes. And the Reform movement said, no, we're going to use German because the majority of our people know German best, and therefore it will make the most sense. And even though we're certainly not a Reform congregation, the conservative movement, and indeed most Orthodox synagogues as well, said, you know what? It's not a bad idea to fix a bit of learning and a bit of teaching and a bit of preaching on Shabbat for the benefit of the community. And so it's stuck around since, and I don't have to give a 3-hour sermon for Shabbat HaGadol. And you don't have to listen to a 3-hour sermon. Was that a hand or? Mhm.
or not in a dairy, but they worked in industrial places, and they didn't get the opportunity to study like our ancestors did.
They did and they didn't. You know, there's actually a fascinating field of research of what was the average Jewish life like. Because we have a tendency, because of the availability heuristic, meaning that because we get more information about rabbis, we tend to think in our historical terms of what were the rabbis doing at different generations, because that's what we've got written down, because the main people writing things down were rabbis. So yeah, we get an overabundance of material about their lives and about the community from their perspective. But there is a fascinating field of research of what was the average Jewish life like? What was the woodcutter's life like? What was the tailor's life like? What were the women who worked in these industries alongside their husbands? What were their lives like? And what we have found is that actually in many of these communities, people did study. Even at pre-industrial and post-industrial revolution, they did make time to study. And in fact, the bulk of a rabbi's time was taken up with teaching, as well as adjudicating difficulties within the community. And the Shabbat services were very far down the list of what a rabbi's responsibilities were for most communities. So they would be studying, the average person, or at least they would have opportunity to study, by coming back late at night from cutting wood, and they would get together with other people in their guild or in their community, and they would study a little. And maybe the rabbi would be helping them, or maybe somebody in their group would have studied with the rabbi, and now they're becoming the teacher, you know, to their group. There was an awful lot of study. But where we really saw the change was in the Reform movement. Why they felt this was so important was partly because of the assimilation tendency, which is that you had more Jews who weren't living around other Jews as much. And those people were not studying as much, because they didn't have a social circle of Jews that were committed to study, and therefore, yes, the synagogue became even more vital as a link for holding them in the Jewish world. And of course, it became important in the early Reform movement as a way of preaching the difference between themselves and what they were trying to reject. So it became a very persuasive kind of presentations. We should not be listening to the Talmud. We should not be listening to these rabbis. Listen to me instead. This is what Judaism is supposed to be.
And they dressed up.
Oh, absolutely. They didn't dress up. They dressed like non-Jews who go to church, which means top hat and tails. For those of you that are uncomfortable wearing a suit and tie to shul, imagine if you were required to come in top hat and tails. That was the norm in the 1800s. And it spread to not only the Reform movement, but most movements began to dress more and more like their non-Jewish counterparts. Many people here, I'm sure, are familiar with the shtreimel, the furry hat within certain Hasidic groups. That's not a Jewish hat. That is an Eastern European top hat. And they still wear it, even though Eastern European fashion moved on, because they got locked into Eastern European fashion at a particular time. And then as their communities became more frozen, if you will, in their traditions, they kept the fashion of the 1800 Polish aristocracy, even as the Polish aristocracy moved on. So that shtreimel is the same as a top hat. And those that don't have top hats, well, there's a reason why they shifted and why they're stuck in the 1950s, because that's when their groups got going. So there is still a dress code in many congregations, but it is always based on either contemporary non-Jewish dress culture or on the non-Jewish dress culture of a particular decade or century, even if it's not contemporary at the moment.
I once saw on my first trip to Israel, we walked through their sharim,
Mm-hmm.
and we saw Jews who were going to shul, but they were in silk robes like
Mm-hmm.
pajamas.
Yes, there is a whole taxonomy of clothing within different groups of Jewish Orthodox groups, that you can tell exactly which community they're from based upon, does their coat go down this far? Does it go down that far? How high, how broad is the brim on the hat? Whether or not they have a certain type of belt, and where they wear the belt, you can really differentiate. But let's save that for another time, because I still want to use our time today for Pesach more than doing bird watching of different Jewish groups. Okay, so I just want to take one last attempt at my presentation, then more questions and comments are welcome, which is on the back side. The very last page, you'll notice a little table, a little chart. And at the very top, we have the quote taken from the Mishnah, Pesachim. Chapter 10 is where we see the outlines, the skeleton of what we would recognize as being the Seder. And as it explains, they pour him a second cup, and here the child asks the parent, and according to the child's understanding, the parent teaches, beginning with shame and concluding with praise, interpreting from Arami Oved Avi. My father was a wandering Aramean, which is the passage taken from Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 10, until he finishes the entire passage. That is the Magid. That is the section of the Seder that takes up the most time during your Seder. This is the part of the Seder where everyone starts going, when do we eat, when do we eat, when do we eat? This is the part that contains Dayenu and all the other elements that are so familiar. It contains the 4 questions your child will ask you. Notice that mentioning there. And it gives a few examples. Like I said in the sermon, only 3 are mentioned in the Mishnah, even though we're now at 4. It is also where we get the idea of having 4 different types of questions, meaning from the 4 different children. But all of those are alluded to. They are not delineated as being maxims that must be recited in a particular liturgical block. The idea of doing it as a block is something that eventually developed over the centuries as people came up with better ways of presenting certain material. But one thing that was delineated was Deuteronomy 26, 5 to 10. And that is, if you look at the table, the left-hand column, top to bottom. That's it, right? My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt and sojourned there with a few people and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. The Egyptians suspected us of evil and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. With great awe and with signs and wonders, he brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now I will bring the first fruits of the soil that you, Lord, have given me. You'll notice that last line isn't actually in the table, it's below the table because we don't mention that last line during the Seder. We finish with great awe, with signs and wonders. Done. Okay, what's going on here? Well, that left-hand column from Deuteronomy, this is the declaration that a person would make when they would come to Jerusalem with bikurim, with the first fruits, as it's a special type of sacrifice that happens in Jerusalem. And when they come, they have to say the left-hand column. Now the rabbi said, you know what? That declaration is perfect. It is the ultimate summary, shorthand version of the Exodus. I mean, sure, you could go back to the book of Exodus and start with Exodus 1 and read through like the first 18 chapters and get the same story. But if you think the Seder is long now, imagine reading through 18 chapters of the Exodus. Additionally, reading through all 18 chapters of the beginning of the book of Exodus would miss the point. On the right-hand side, opposite those different words, can you tell what we're looking at here, or can you read the explanation, or based off what I mentioned from the earlier section in the Mishnah? What's going on the right-hand side? An explanation. More than an explanation, an interpretation. So, what's the difference? Because I'm being a little pedantic. Right? What's the difference between an explanation and an interpretation? An explanation means I'll tell you what it means. An interpretation is I'll tell you what it means so that you will feel it more. The interpretation is there not just so that we understand what we mean by signs and wonders, but so that by understanding them, we will feel what we are meant to feel. And there is no guarantee, in fact, quite the opposite, that reading 18 chapters of the book of Exodus is going to make you feel what you should feel at the Seder. Instead, our sages said, take this short version, 5 verses, read it, but feel it. Think about each word. What does it mean, toil? What does it mean, oppression? What does it mean, a mighty hand? What is actually going on here, and how does that make us feel? What were we being subjected to, and what was that emotionally like for us, spiritually like for us? This is meant to be the example. Now, in many households, it will be simply read, and you will get something along the lines of, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt, compelled by divine decree, and sojourned there. He did not come down to settle in Egypt, but only to live there temporarily, as it is written. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land. That's missing the point. This is always the danger when anytime something is written in Jewish text, is that people will think it's written down, therefore I must recite it. It is so frustrating because it was written down because the interpretation was considered such a useful technique, a useful phrasing to help people emotionally connect to the story. If you feel it's not helping you emotionally connect to the story, to such an extent, as I've heard from many people, that they simply skip this whole section and they go straight on to Dayenu, 3 or 4 of the verses, then you need to recast it. Keep the left-hand column, but talk about what it means, about what it feels. It doesn't have to be the carbon copy midrash that the Haggadah presents. It can be, well, what do I think it meant? And what do I feel when it says he went down to Egypt? What questions do I have about that? What does it mean that he sojourned there? Why does it use the word sojourn, which is such a strange English word, meaning to dwell somewhere temporarily? What do I associate with dwelling temporarily? What do I feel in the modern world that relates? Because all of this was meant to make the Seder story relevant to our ancestors in each generation. And if you're not making the Seder relevant to yourself, to your own personal life, and to your own questions and struggles and worries of the current situation in this world, then you're missing the point of the Seder. It is not just meant to be recited. To recite it, all we have to do is hit play on a YouTube video of someone reading the Haggadah. And that's not the point. The point is, what does it mean to you? So, you have rabbinic permission, you have rabbinic instruction. Feel the Seder, tell the story, use the framework of Deuteronomy, use these simple short lines, and imagine, what do these actually mean to me? And share that with the people around you at the table. You'll probably disagree. You might argue over some of it. That's okay. There's a reason why the Seder records arguments as well in the Haggadah, because we are supposed to be debating and discussing what this all means. Because it's only by doing that that it can actually have living meaning for us, rather than being a dead and static document. So, yes, there are a lot of pages in the Haggadah, and all of those pages were added to take another shot at hopefully hitting that spirit, that heart, that feeling in you. And if the first version doesn't hit you, the Avadim Hayinu, then we'll go on to the next version. And if that doesn't hit you, we'll go on to the next version. And if that doesn't hit you, we'll do the next version. And you only got to be hit once. Right? And maybe it is for you, Dayenu. Maybe for you it is the 3 symbols that are mentioned at the end. Maybe it is the 10 plagues. Maybe it is the B'nai Barak story. I don't know what is going to hit you. But that's why we have this shotgun version of a retelling, in order that somewhere in this you will find yourself. You will see yourself standing there in Egypt. You will feel what our ancestors felt, and you will feel what they felt with the liberation, and that will matter to you. It will change you, and it will be meaningful for what you do later in the week and the year and your life. And if you haven't found it yet, you've got to do the work. The Seder is not going to do it for you. It is not a passive experience. It is like, if you expect the Seder to transform you, it is like walking into a gym and thinking that because you did, somehow you're healthier by just being in the space. Right? You've got to actually do the work. And you know what? Some people are going to love the free weights, and other people are going to love aerobics. And that's okay. You got to find, though, what's going to work for you. That's why our Seder is so, well, eclectic to be diplomatic, or haphazard is as in this random collection of so many different attempts to try and stir the soul. It's not because it can't make up its mind, it's because it doesn't know who it's talking to. You could be any one of the 4 kids, you could be a completely different archetype. And the Seder is doing its best to make itself relevant to you, but you got to meet it more than halfway.
You talked about the generational rifts. Even though very conscientiously we have the Haggadahs, some that came from Maxwell House Coffee or others who do a lot over the years. But in recent years, it's my grandchildren have written their own. And they use symbols. Last year, actually, one of my daughters got in trouble because along with the symbols that were not part of Maxwell House and so on, the orange for women, the water for Miriam, and so forth, they decided to put watermelon on the table as a symbol of the racist problems in the United States. And for all the black people who were enslaved here. And that turned out to be very controversial among the woke people in the family, of whom there are young people who said that was a racist symbol. Of course, they were pointing out that's what it's all about. We're talking about being released from slavery, and this is a symbol of this part of our population that were slaves in this country. So sometimes in this generational, whatever you were talking about earlier, we also have difference of opinion of what's appropriate, which makes lively discussions and awareness.
I love your phrase, lively discussion. And I hope it is lively rather than acrimonious. But, you know, that is a very good example that symbols will only mean what people help each other realize they mean. You know, a symbol does not speak for itself. A symbol is embedded within a culture and within a community. And yes, I could absolutely see why some people would consider a symbol of the racial stereotypes as the best symbol of how we should stand against racism and the legacy of slavery in this country. And other people say, how dare you use an actual racial stereotype as a symbol of the racism that has been part of our country's history. And you're right. There isn't a right or wrong answer to that. It's a question of, but do we both agree that racism in this country needs to be part of our discussion, and the legacy of slavery needs to be part of our discussion? And now we can talk about what might be a better symbol, or what might be the perfect symbol. But let's make sure that we realize we're on the same team here, that we all agree that racism is and was a huge problem, and we're just struggling with a way to find a way to remind ourselves of that, whether it be this symbol, that symbol, or a different one. And you will always have that struggle. You know, anytime we put things into the Seder plate or the Seder table, we need to be wondering, what does this actually mean, and do we articulate that well enough? Some people have trouble articulating what it means from even just the few that are already on our, as you put it, Maxwell House Seder. And those need to be articulated as well. And just reading through, you know, these are the 3 symbols is not often enough to help people relate to what they are meant to symbolize. But hopefully it is a good template. So I do hope that it is a lively debate and continues to be a lively debate and discussion. Other questions, comments, or insights that have worked well at your Seder, or questions you still have that you want, you know, someone else to weigh in on? All right, then I guess we are done for our nutshell. Shabbat Shalom, a Chag Sameach, a reminder that my phone number is freely available, my email is freely available. If you have last-minute questions, please let me know, but ask it earlier rather than last minute if you can.